My background is in environmental history, and I was hearing more and more troubling news about our food system and how it affected the environment. Factory farms were polluting rivers and estuaries, wetlands were being converted to farmlands, farmlands were being converted to suburbia, herbicides were contaminating drinking water, mercury was showing up, making it unsafe to eat too much fish. And yet when I went to the supermarket to shop, it was as if I entered an entirely different world. You know, food was plentiful and cheap. There was Tony the Tiger and Aunt Jemima, thousands of products as familiar as ever. But I somehow started to realize that all those products, all the foods on all the shelves, had real stories. And I knew none of them. And somehow I was just really struck by the absurdity of that situation. I mean, I'd been shopping, of course, for 20 years or something as an adult, and it never really had occurred to me in that way before. But when it did, it was as if everything that was familiar became cryptic, and I just started to feel like this was really a mystery of everyday life, something that all of us confronted, but without really paying much attention to it. And so because of my background in history, I was really fascinated about I wondered, how did we get into this situation when we know so little about what we eat and just think it's normal? Well, kitchen literacy is an expression that I use to refer to what we know about our foods and how we know it. And so in my book, Kitchen Literacy, I look at this through time. I go back to kitchens in the pre-industrial time frame and look at what people knew about their foods. That's how I begin the book. And I found that it was really surprising. They expected to know different kinds of things about their foods. For example, in pre-industrial America, people expected to know very specific things about their foods, about the places and particulars of where their foods came from, stories about their foods. In the case of meat, they expected to know about the age, sex, and background of animals that became meat. And of course, these are things we never even think about anymore today. And as I went back and looked into the diaries, I looked at this wonderful diary of a woman named Martha Ballard, who was one of few women who kept a diary in the late 18th century. And as I followed through her everyday life, I really discovered that there were stories to every single one of her foods. You know, she'd write something like, had baked lamb and string beans for dinner one night. And then I'd go back through and I could see where she had planted the string bean, the date that she had planted it, the date that she had hoed or weeded in that bed, and then of course the days that she picked the string beans, you know, first. I just found it remarkable that the way that the stories of the foods and the stories of her life kind of braided together, because the whole work of cooking and provisioning oneself was just an all-encompassing part of life.
One of the comments that you had made was about 20th century urbanization and the idea of families moving away from the farms, people moving away from the source of their food. And there's this idea that people miss this fundamental connection with the earth. I think you referred to it as nature instinct starved. Mm-hmm. Are we starved?
Well, that refers to actually about 100 years ago, when cities grew, people were anxious about this idea of separating from nature. I mean, this is something we think of as a very modern thing. There's, I think, a recent book out called Nature Deficit Disorder. People are thinking about it now, but people thought about it 100 years ago as the food system was industrializing. And it was actually that first generation of people that were moving from farms into cities. And so I think they were really right at that turning point in American history. And they were very concerned about that. And that particular quotation is actually from a woman who was a teacher in a school garden program about 100 years ago. People were concerned, and so progressive reformers started nature study in school garden programs. And in 1897, 26,000 students in New York State alone participated in these kind of gardens. And the teacher said that it was a revelation and an intense joy for students, for kids whose nature instinct had been starved, to grow vegetables. I think the idea of a nature instinct, I'm not sure if I would necessarily feel comfortable promoting that or, you know, if that's true or not. But I think having an awareness that we live in a context, in an ecological context, is really important. I mean, we can all, if we just, you know, live in our houses and don't realize that, you know, where our water goes, where our waste goes, where our food comes from, I think that we can delude ourselves into thinking that that somehow, you know, the earth is ours to have and everything will continue to go just fine forever. And I think we need to have a little bit more of a grounding in reality.